program.
What you talking about?
The program. The program. Get with the program.
Everybody clap to this. Say what?
Get with the program.
It starts now.
Hello and welcome to Get With The Program Radio Show. I'm your host, Gary Jones. Now, Get With The Program Radio Show is a multicultural, informative, relevant, and entertaining 1-hour weekly show offering you a combination of diverse interviews with questions and comments. And as always, we will act as a positive source of information. Now listen, if you want to be a guest on the show, all you have to do is log in to www.getwiththeprogram.biz. Shoot me an email, leave me a message. You never know, you may have a conversation that we would love to talk about. Or you can give me a call at 919-665-1118. Again, it's 919-665-1118. Today we're going to be joined in a conversation with Geraldine Alshemy. Geraldine Alshemy is a community activist for social justice. Now today we're going to be talking about the case of Leandro versus North Carolina Supreme Court. Basically what that is, Leandro's state of North Carolina had a decision over 2 decades ago that held every child as a state constitutional right to access to a sound basic education. Now, the courts also found that North Carolina was not meeting this constitutional requirement. Now, hello, Geraldine, and welcome to the show.
Hello, and hello to our listening audience.
Wonderful. It's a pleasure to have you here today. You know that, right?
It is awesome to be here. It is awesome to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Before we get started, Geraldine, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been doing this work around social justice 46 years. The predominant part of my work has been done in education. Years ago, I began to see young black males on the streets during school hours and began to wonder, why are so many children on the streets during school hours? And come to find out that so many of them have been suspended.
Now, you're from this area, right?
I am from Eastern North Carolina.
Eastern North Carolina. Wow. Eastern North. Now, when you say, is it far eastern?
Wilson, North Carolina. But I've worked,
that's right.
Yeah, I've worked all of Eastern North Carolina, Mississippi, New Orleans, just throughout the southwestern parts of North Carolina.
Wonderful, wonderful. So now, the Leandro case. To you, I noticed you have a certain passion about it because I spoke with you the other night about this. Why is this case so important? I mean, what is the Leandro versus State of North? What is this all about?
Well, as many people don't know, in 1994, 5 of the poorest school districts in North Carolina filed a lawsuit against the state. Those they were Cumberland, Hope, Halifax, Robertson, and Vance counties. That lawsuit argued that their school district was severely underfunded. Even though they were paying the highest tax rates, same as other counties, they were not getting the funding. And Leandro still remains the largest education issue in the state of North Carolina. But yet so many North Carolinians don't know anything about it.
Now, Leandro, where did that name come from?
Leandro was the name of the plaintiff in the case. A young man, I think he was from from Halifax County. I think that's where he was from, but that was his name. His name was Rob Leandro. Okay. He was a young man who had a learning disability, I think, but that young man has gone on now to become a lawyer, and he works here in Raleigh, North Carolina with Poe Parker. I think it's Poe Parker and something that here in Raleigh as strangely enough, as a healthcare lawyer.
Wow.
Yeah, I would have thought that he would have been an education lawyer, but no, he became a healthcare.
That's interesting. He's right here in North Carolina, Raleigh.
Right here in Raleigh, North
I'm going to have to reach out to him sooner the better. Now, I noticed, and I could see it in your eyes from the conversation, and you and I met the other night at the event, and I was very glad to meet you there. Now, why is this case so important to you?
This case is about school funding. It is important because it adversely affects low-income students living in rural counties, black children, brown children, students with disabilities, and English language learners. They are the ones stuck in schools without funding, with poor resources, less qualified teachers and administrators, not enough counselors or social workers, not enough school nurses or academic remediation. The lack of school funding has consistently been a problem for the more vulnerable populations. for more than 50 years now, actually longer than that. When we think about it, every problem that we have in public school, when we talk about students not graduating, when we talk about children being failing, basically comes from the fact that they don't have the resources, particularly in low-income areas. They don't have the resources that other schools have. So if you don't have the resources, how can you compete and how can you be academically successful when you don't have those resources?
And you're right. Without the resources, I can remember when I go back some years, and I can remember my grandmother and them telling me that once upon a time that we had secondary school books in our schools. The African American students, black students. By the time we got the textbooks, they weren't new. They had been used. Pages
sometimes years old.
Sometimes years and pages were torn out of them. So we was definitely missing some of the education.
That's right.
You know, so that is definitely a relevant conversation there. Now, I know we spoke about the Leandro, and you just mentioned a little bit about it. Tell me some more history about Leandro.
In 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that North Carolina was in violation of the state constitution because they refused to fulfill their obligation to provide funding that assured that every child received a sound basic education. The state constitution in itself says that every child in North Carolina will be provided a sound basic education. That means that these children are not even, when you talk about a sound basic education, if you're not providing a sound basic education, then they're not even getting, think about it, they're barely getting any real education at all. If you think about, the state requires you to have a sound, which what that means is you have to be proficient in math, reading, I guess reading, writing, arithmetic is what they used to say, and now it's the sciences. So if our children are not getting a sound basic education, then that puts them well below what their academic requirement is, and it's no wonder they are graduating not even able to read. Wow.
And you know, with that being said, Geraldine, even though we went through those struggles and we're still going through them now, our students, African American students, are graduating still as doctors. We're still moving forward. Can you imagine what that would have been like if we had the appropriate or the education that we needed? If everything had been in place. Now, I do want to ask you this question. Do you think this system was set up by design?
Of course. I mean, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but of course it's set up by design. There's always been the intent to deny poor children, the same population of children, poor children, black children, brown children, children with disabilities, and particularly now English language learners, to deny them access to that education. Why? Because of competitiveness. You know, wealthier communities want for sure want their children to fare better than anybody else, because what is it really about? It's really about who gets the more well-paid jobs, who's controlling, who's leading, who has the power. So if you have the education, if you have control over the educational system, then what does it mean? You maintain control over the larger part of society, really.
Now, I noticed the judge that handled this case. Do you think that the justice system had a big role in this whole situation?
When you say the justice system, of course, you mean
the
school to prison pipeline. When we talk about the school to prison pipeline, first of all, years ago, I coined the phrase homeschool prison cycle many years ago, back in the early 90s. That's when I was telling you about when I began to see so many of our children out on the streets during school hours, and coming to find out they were being suspended from school for so many frivolous infractions that their peers, their white peers, where our children were getting long-term suspensions and sometimes expulsion. These children were getting phone calls to the families. Some I remember in particular was when the zero tolerance came into existence, and children. I remember one child that I advocated for. He had somebody had drawn a gun and put it on the bulletin board, and he took the paper off the bulletin board and was flapping it around, pow, 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 and he was suspended for the year. While another kid had brought his father's hunting rifle to school, and his parents were called to come and get the hunting rifle, and nothing was done. So there's always been that inequity in the way that the suspensions have been used, and that's been from the early 90s on up until now. So and when you look at any data, you will find that poor children, black children are disproportionately suspended for the same offenses that other white children are getting who are not suspended. So we've seen the inequity.
Now, what we're going to do, we're going to take a break here, and when we come back, I want to ask you, the court mandate, has it been ignored as far as this whole process and finally in court? And I think you and I mentioned that they came to a decision. But when we come back, I want to touch on the court mandate. Has it been ignored, and what difference does this make as far as in reference to time? We're going to take a break, and I'll be right back after this. Hello, welcome back to Get With The Program Radio Show again. I am your host. Today we're joining a conversation with Miss Geraldine Alshemy. I make sure I get that right. Geraldine is a community advocate for social justice. Today we're talking about the Leandro versus North Carolina case, and we're having a wonderful conversation. Welcome back, Geraldine.
Thank you so much.
Now, before we took the break, I know I did mention I wanted to talk about the court mandate, but there was some more history behind this that we didn't quite touch. What was the remaining part that you want to focus on? We
talked about the case being entered in 1997, and nothing was done. So then in 2004, the courts ruled again that the state was in violation of the Constitution because they continued to refused to provide the necessary funding to provide North Carolina children with a sound basic education. So in 2018, Judge Lee took over the case after Judge Manning. Judge Manning was the one that started on the case, and then Judge Howard Manning, and then Judge David Lee took the case after Judge Manning retired. So Judge Lee ordered an independent education consultation with West Ed. And what the responsibility of West Ed was to do a report and identify ways that North Carolina could comply with the order to fund schools appropriately. The report was released on December 18th of 2019. They found that in order to get the state compliant with the law, that they needed to do certain things, and that they needed to provide funding in certain areas. And they looked at the areas of competent teachers. They looked at principals, well-educated or well-qualified teachers and principals. They looked at pre-K education, and there was one more I can't remember, but I will get to it. And so they proposed this plan to Judge Lee, and Judge Lee then again on November 10th, Judge Lee gave an order once again.
Order to fund.
In order to fund, yes. So we're talking about more than 25 years that these folks have not complied to an order to comply with the state constitution. We're talking about the state constitution.
So what I'm hearing is that other schools are getting more funding, more money than some of the lesser schools. They're getting more funding. So what I'm hearing, they select certain schools that they want to make sure they get the most money.
Schools are funded by the tax dollars. So if I live in a high wealth district, then my school is going to get more money because the money that goes into the county is also allotted for schools. So that means that they're going to get more money. A school that has a smaller tax base, and for instance, if you don't have a lot of people who own homes, like in poor communities and schools that are located in poor communities, there's not a large tax base because not a lot of people own their homes, so they're not paying the taxes. So that's what makes the difference between the high wealth district and the low wealth district.
So that pretty much affects the African American and lower income people.
Exactly.
Wow. And with that being said, but yet we're bused in different areas
Well, that came
later on.
that came with some years ago as districts were trying to bring in. It was supposed to be diversity, and I say quote diversity. So what they were supposed to have been doing was bringing in the wealthier white families into black communities, into their schools, and they made those schools magnet schools. Basically what it means in layman's term is that white people came into black communities to put their children in magnet schools so that their children would get a private school education on the public dollar. What happened was that the children that lived in that community got bussed out of the community, sometimes 30, 40 miles away from home, with schools that had less funding. So it still amounted to the same thing.
Wow. And that all goes back to who's in office, who we vote for. All of that kind of go around into the whole justice system and the budget.
It really goes back to the complacency of communities to speak and act. No, that's what it goes back to, because my saying is that if you are not at the table, then you are on the menu. Yes.
Yep. That's a good way to do it. I like that. I'm gonna have to use that one. I appreciate that. That was a good one. Now, in reference to this court mandate has been ignored. What's different this time?
I mean, what? Let's start with what's happening right now.
Yes.
So on Wednesday, November 10th, Judge Lee ordered North Carolina to put an additional $1.7 billion into public education over the next 2 years. The money would go into a fund to make sure that students in North Carolina are getting a sound basic education. It's really about putting enough money in the budget that will provide children with that sound basic education. And that's that. If you look at the media reports from last week on this, you'll find that to be true.
Mm-hmm.
The order from Wake County Superior Judge David Lee is the latest twist in a legal saga spanning more than 25 years. At its core, the dispute is about giving school districts enough money to provide students with the education that they need, and fulfilling the constitutional obligation, and fulfilling what the Constitution says that they're supposed to get. That court mandate has been ignored. And you say, what's different at this time? Well, the judge order gives North Carolina General Assembly. The General Assembly creates the state budget.
Mm-hmm.
So it is giving them 30 days to fully fund the educational plan. If the General Assembly does not fund the plan in the new budget, the court ordered the state budget office and the treasurer to transfer about $1.7 billion to education to be distributed mostly to Department of Human Services, Department of Public Instructions, and to the North Carolina UNC health systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, with me, I just wonder, so what does UNC systems have to do with providing our children with a sound basic public education? And this is where I say that community must step in too much, because it doesn't matter how much. If you're talking about the 1.7 million being allotted within the next 2 years, and it won't be allotted without a fight, but who's going to track that money to know where it's going and how it's benefiting our children? If we don't do it. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why it has not been done over 25 years, is because we have not been involved. We don't know anything about it. We've not advocated for our children. We assume, we talk about in our communities, oh, these children, they're not educated, they're not this and they're not whatever, and they're doing this and they're doing that. Well, think about this. If I am in a school where I am repeatedly seen as a failure, what does that do to a child's emotional and psychological? What does it do? It tears them down. So why wouldn't they lean to being in the streets or being away from school or cutting up in school to get that attention? So while we point our finger out at the children and the vulnerable families, we are just as guilty, because we are not really advocating for our children. Let's go back to pre-civil rights era. We fought for educational rights. All of us, we were about education. We were about making sure that all children got a good education. But then after civil rights, and some of us began to, as they say, arrive.
Right.
Some of us began to arrive. We forgot about everybody else and started blaming, like they did all of us. We are just as much responsible and just as gatekeepers, I call it. We are being gatekeepers to the system. You know what I'm saying? I remember being in a place where I was able to look at some policy around parent involvement. It's been years ago. And we were over at the Sanford School of Law, and we were looking at policy as to how to get parents transportation to schools. And I remember one of the principals saying, "Oh, they don't need transportation." This is a black woman. "They don't need transportation. If they can get to the clubs, they can get to the schools." Yeah. So, but you don't hear white folks say that about their children. You don't hear them say those things about their children. But we will get into a place where we can really make a difference and have a voice, and we will spew out our bias. We'll spew it out to cause harm rather than hurt.
You know what's so ironic about it is that you mentioned when we still do march, when the civil rights movement was. You can actually see a lot in the news. You still see it now, but we only see things happening that when people start marching is when there's a death, when something major happens. We're not marching like we used to march, we're still there. But what I find, Geraldine, is that once we start protesting and we start marching, and again, you mentioned we think we've reached the promised land, we stop marching and stop protesting. And I think some people who are against that, they sit and wait and say, well, they'll march today, they'll march for 3 or 4 months, but it'll quiet down and we just go back where we are. So I see that happening a lot. But what we're going to do, we're going to take another break. And when I come back, you had wanted me to ask this question. Why do you think other politicians, particularly Republicans, why were they so aggressively fighting this order? Why were they so aggressively fighting this order? Be right back after this message. Hello, welcome back to Get With The Program Radio Show. Again, I'm your host, Gary Jones. Today we're joined in the conversation with Miss Geraldine Alshemy. Alshemy, got it. She's a community advocate for social justice. Today we're talking about the Leandro versus North Carolina case, the Supreme Court of North Carolina, in its landmark versus Leandro versus North Carolina decision over 2 decades ago. Held that every child has a state constitutional right to access to a sound basic education. The courts also found that North Carolina was not meeting this constitutional requirement. Geraldine, welcome back to the show.
Thank you again.
Now, I know we talked about, I want to ask you, why do you think other parties was acting so aggressively fighting this order? But do you think the money will be in the budget that they're pushing?
No, that budget has already been done. It's been held up for a very long time, and school districts across the state have been fighting to get it released. So the State Board of Education is recommending the new budget to include the $1.7 million. So when we ask about where's the money for our schools, and
was it $1.7 billion or $1.7 billion?
$1.7 billion. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times we ask, so where's the money for our schools? And well, hey, it's laying up in an account with more than $13 billion in a reserve account and forecasted revenue. That's where the money is. Just laying there.
Just laying there.
Just laying there. So that is the problem. And why do I think that Republicans are so aggressively fighting this order?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, when you look at the population of students that is affecting, who are they? Black, brown, students with disabilities, English language learners, rural children. We know historically that those children, those communities have been overlooked, period. I would even go as far to say that it's part of the systematic oppression. If we don't educate them, then we always have a minority workforce. Okay. So I think you got to look at the thinking of who's in control, and you have those Republicans, Spielberger, and I can't remember the other one's name, Moore. You got to look at the mindset of those people as to why. Ask yourself, why would anybody violate the law for 25 years and not even worry about it? There's been so much evidence of bias and discrimination. And they also say, according to the news report, that the order was politically motivated, and what I mean by politically motivated, they say that the governor and people in the community, which were the litigants in the case, are trying to take away their power, and that's all it's about. That they're trying to take away their political power. So when you talk about this politically motivated people, you are in the business of politics. Okay, that's why
that was going to be one of my questions. Where is the role of the governor? What's going on with the governor? How does he feel about this?
Well, the governor has the veto power, and of course, the governor apparently applauded the effort. According to the news, he applauded the effort. So. And he has the veto power, so if he wanted to veto it, he could, but he's not doing that.
So what do our citizens need to be aware of? I mean, what do we need to be watching out for now?
What I want to do is I want to go back a little bit.
Okay.
I want to go back to when we talked about Spielberger and Tim Moore thinking that this takes away our power. Yet you have violated the Constitution for more than 25 years by not following the state constitution and the court order to fix the constitutional violation. So the appropriation clause, the judge says that this clause cannot be read to override the plaintiffs' dispute in saying that they deserve a sound basic education. So the state constitution does empower the courts to act. What they're saying is that we're going to sue. We're going to sue because you don't have that right. Basically, you don't have that right to take away our power. Well, according to the courts and according to the plaintiffs, the state constitution does empower the courts to act when other branches refuse to carry out constitutional obligations. The judge counteracts that claim by saying that you can't violate the Constitution by trying to fix a constitutional violation. As we have said over and over and over again, you've had 25 years to comply. So the judge ordered the executive branch with the governor, state treasurer, and the controller to take that role. The judge has given those he's given them 30 days to get it together and put that money in the budget themselves and have it done by December 10th.
Again, we did say that the governor, he supports the ruling. So as we move along, I know we got a short period of time here. So what do our citizens need to be aware of? What do we need to be looking out for now as we move forward?
Those who care about the education of our children, especially those people who represent the population of children who are being adversely affected. Brown children, I'll say it again, black children, brown children, rural children, children with disabilities, English language learners, those families, those community people who really care about the education of all children should be organized. And first they should be informed. So this is why this radio piece here is so vitally important, because there's so many people in the community who know nothing about Leandro, particularly the folks who represent this population of children. So the first thing we have to do is we have to begin to do some political organizing. The voices of our children and the parents have to work together collectively to lift up those voices and to say to our Republican leaders that we won't stand for it. We won't stand for you to go another 25 years without giving our children what the state constitution says that they should be getting. So organizing, mobilizing, lifting up our voices and standing up to the Republicans who refuse to do what they're supposed to do. While as politicians they'll talk about the wrong that the judge is doing and what he's violated. What about what you're doing?
There we go. Mm-hmm. Now, in reference to this funding and the money that's been shorted for years, I want to be specific. What race? I know you mentioned black, brown, but particularly all the races. It really affects most races except the white race, or most of the people.
It affects poor white children who have disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
There's many white children who have disabilities, but the predominantly you will find black children, brown children, which are still those children who are English language learners. Mm-hmm. Children living in rural areas, children living in those areas where the schools are not well funded, in low wealth districts is what I mean. So when we talk about that population of children, yes, in everything that we do, it will be predominantly black children or children of color.
Now, how based on your opinion, how is the Supreme Court of North Carolina's decision, the decision that they've made, how is that relevant to young North Carolinians? Because you got the new generation coming up. How relevant is that?
We have to understand that before we can move children to a college and wherever, you have to first educate them. Mm-hmm. If we are not educating our children, we will continue with the same cycle of our children going to the streets. And as I said, think about the emotional and the psychological effect that it has on children. If you don't have self-worth, if you don't think that you can do, if you don't see yourself as able to, because predominantly our children don't see themselves in those roles as, unless they have a different type of upbringing, I'll say. They don't see themselves in that role as leaders. Usually it takes encouragement. It takes them being able to see, and I'll say that in my own family, it takes families really trying to encourage children. But when you are in a situation where you are constantly seen as a failure, then they start to believe that. It's just like when you say, now our kids are saying, well, I won't live to be 16 years of age. Think about where that came from. Mm-hmm. Think about where that came from. That came from other folk who had an opinion that they won't live to be 16 years of age. But so they bought into that, which is now affecting what they believe. So they want what they want, and they want it fast. They want it now. They want it, right now. Mm-hmm. When we, as the general public, begin to say to our children, and we say that through our involvement, we say that through, just like children saw when folks stood up for police brutality. Mm-hmm. You see that who was it that was mostly involved? It was mostly young people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're standing up now. We're gonna take another break. When I come back, I want to ask you this question: Who you think is responsible for providing this baseline level education, or perhaps should we have our own schools and start funding our own schools and making sure that we have the education that we need? We're gonna take a break. When we come back, we're gonna have more conversation here with Miss Geraldine. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back after this. Hello, welcome back to Get With The Program radio show. Again, I'm your host, Gary Jones, joining the conversation today with Miss Geraldine Alshemy.
Got it.
And she's a community advocate for social justice. Today we're talking about the Leandro versus North Carolina case. Welcome back to the show, Geraldine.
Thank you once again. Okay,
now I did ask you before we left, who is responsible for providing the baseline level of education? And basically, should we have our own schools and come together as a unit and provide our own money and quit waiting for the government to do things for us?
The first question was, who's responsible? We all are responsible. We send our children, the reason we pay taxes, the reason we send our children to school is because we all are responsible. But when we get our children, when we look at how schools are funded, then it is our legislators' responsibility to put the money there. It is those who we hire who are responsible to provide that education. It is our families who are responsible for preparing, encouraging, and putting our children in a position so that they can receive that education. Should we? First of all, I don't believe that we should have ever integrated schools in the beginning. That's my belief. You have Indian education, you have the Jews educate their children, you have everybody else that can educate. It's okay for everybody else to do whatever they need to do to have their own, except for black folk.
Why do you think integration came with the school system? Because I know there was some African Americans who had more position with finances. They wanted their children to go to white schools. Why do you think this integration came?
Because of the mindset. Because of the mindset of blacks back in the day. And let's go back to the history of education when it was an all black school. It wasn't as though there was not that bias even then. My mother was the victim of the light skin versus the dark skin. And here what happened was that my auntie, who was a mulatto, and my grandfather, who built the first school in Johnson County. Now hear me. My great grandfather built the first school. My grandmother brought the teachers from the north, because that's where you used to get them from, was from the north. So my grandmother brought the teachers from the north and housing it. So we talking about my grandfather, now my grandmother. Then my uncle was on the Board of Education. The teachers lived in the house with my grandmother. But here you had a black child and a mulatto child in the same house. The teachers made such a difference between the light-skinned child and the black child, till the black child was taken out of school at an early age. She can't learn. And so they took her out of the school and she worked on the farm while her light-skinned sister was continuing to be educated. So even with that, our children were still getting a better education than they are today. Hear what I said. In that time, I'm talking about my mother was not, you're talking about 1918 on there. My mother had a third grade education that was equivalent to what children, and this is according to, I think it's SAS who did the study, and said that the average child now is graduating high school with the equivalent education of a ninth grade education. So if in 1918 that children could come out to third grade and had the equivalent of a ninth grade education, what have we done? What have we done? So when you say, do we need to? Yes, it would be great if we could educate our children, but the question becomes more of, do we have the mindset? Do we have the heart? Do we have the love for the total community to do that? I hear that all the time. Oh, we should have our own schools. Yeah, we should have our own schools. But if we are so divided that we won't even stand up for a 25-year-old mandate, if we don't have the wherewithal to even fight for that right, what are we going to, will we have the wherewithal to fund it? No.
That falls back to the accountability piece. Are we going to do what we're supposed to do and be held accountable? Now, this money, I'm going to go back a little bit to the money, because you and I talked a little bit about this before. Now, there's organizations like the North Carolina Education Lottery. Should that money be a part of what's going on? Where is that money at? Is that part of
money is probably part of that money that is laying up in that $13 billion resource. The money that's laid up in that $13 billion. That's probably where some of your state lottery money is. But certainly they are not giving. When you talk about $13 billion and you giving the school system $2 million, what is that?
That makes me wonder, why would someone hold this kind of money and keep it away from bettering greed?
Greed, corruption. Greed and corruption.
Wow, this is incredible. It's basically setting a standard for the future of making sure that certain people or certain entities don't advance.
And it's really about oppression, as it always. The education system has always been the major system of oppression. We can never forget that. How can we forget that when our ancestors' eyes were plucked out, hands were cut off, and they had to hide and risk their life to learn to read? How can we forget that it is the system of oppression? How do we forget that?
According to our Constitution and according to the law and all the things that people in order here, who is most responsible for ensuring that every child receives a sound basic education? Who is responsible? We know it starts from home.
No, the state constitution says that your General Assembly is responsible for making sure that every child, the state of North Carolina is responsible for assuring that every child receives a sound basic education. That comes in by your General Assembly allocating the funding, the correct funding that should be given so that every child can receive that education.
And that's why it's so important to vote.
That's why it's so important not only to vote, because we can't just vote and think that folks gonna do what we've been voting for God knows how long. How long have we been voting, and
Years.
what's the results of us voting?
Right, for years.
So without the accountability of the community, without the accountability of the public, what good is it? I'm not saying don't vote. Of course we should vote, but I'm saying we have to do more than just vote and then walk away and think that everything is going to be okay.
Now, what's so interesting about it, with this kind of money, these billions of dollars out here, and we know it's sitting somewhere in a black hole or in a white hole, sitting somewhere just sitting there waiting. Who is going to follow this? I mean, the governor is there. Who's going to regulate and make sure this money goes in the right place? It sounds like to me that everybody that's going against this, going against funding, making sure everyone gets the proper funding to go to school. It sounds like this whole thing is a design. It's a cable tow connected to each other to make sure that it doesn't happen. Who's going to watch? Who's going to watch them? Who's watching the whole system?
Again, it comes back to one, your state, your state, right? So we got your Republicans who want to keep that money away from folks. You got your courts who says you must give it. You must give it. Now once it's given, the judge has made sure that the money is put out there. The judge has made sure by mandating, if you have not done what you're supposed to do, then somebody else is going to take over that funding. The state controllers, the treasurers, and your governor is going to go on and allot first $1.7 billion. Now the question now becomes, who follows the money? Will it be those advocates, those white advocates who say, we want to make sure that every child receives a sound basic education, and do the same thing that you did with magnet schools and make sure that your children receive a sound basic education? Or will it be all of our like I said, our black community, our black educators, our black teachers, our black parents, our black politicians, the entire black and brown community. What our communities of color need to do is stop all of this infighting, because we got the same problems. The Mexicans, the Puerto Ricans, the Colombians. You don't want to be called Mexican. The blacks. The Mexicans are coming in and taking. Listen, we all have the same oppressor. And if we would come together, we are the majority. We are the majority as it is. But if we would just come together to make sure that things are happening for our children, then we hold the power. And it is our responsibility to make sure that money goes where it's supposed to go. So we need to lay aside whatever little differences that we have, because we are the majority right now. We are the majority.
Particularly when we come together.
We are the majority whether we come together or not. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But if we come together, we have the power.
There we go. Now, one quick question before I go. I find that in politics, this whole thing is separated. State controls the state, federal controls the federal. So sometimes the federal system can't make a decision for the state. I find this now that the state has certain rules that they can do without the federal getting involved. And the federal is the Supreme Court, which is where most of your big Supreme Court people are. It's just so ironic. What is your take on how they're separated? It seems like somebody from the federal, somebody hired that can oversee all of the states, but the states, they will block out the feds. They will block it out.
The federal government gave up its rights many, many years ago in a piece called devolution. What devolution means is that the states devolve the powers down to the states, right? Mm-hmm. So they are no longer over the states. The states have, if you want to call it, independent power. Mm-hmm. So that's where the problem came in, is when the states devolve, and they call it devolution, when the states devolve the power down to the state, when the federals devolve the power down to the states to say, you run your states. You don't need our intervention. We're going to send you the money. You allocate how the money goes. You know what I'm saying? We're just going to send you whatever amount of money, and you are responsible for how it's allocated or how it's distributed. So that's where your problem is. There's very little federal oversight. And that's why, again, it's so vitally important that we be one, educated, mobilized, and organized.
Wow, good information. Ms. Geraldine, that's going to about conclude it for our show today. I just want to thank you for coming by. Now, if somebody wants to get in contact with you for some information, to be able to ask you some questions about the show, how can they contact you?
Well, folks can contact me, number one, by email at Mary, M-A-R-Y, Magdalene, M-A-G-D-A-L-E-N-E, Ministries, M-I-N-I-S-T-R-I-E-S, B as in breaking, B as in vicious, C cycles @gmail.com. That's Mary Magdalene Ministries, BBC @gmail.com. And my phone number, you can reach me by telephone, 919-523-7687. And our website is Mary Magdalene Ministries, BBC.com.
Well, wonderful. There it is. You heard it right there. Once again, I'd like to thank you for coming to the show today. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to bring you back. We're going to flow for real when she comes back. Now, I'm going to tell it to my listeners, I spoken with this lady the other night, and when she come back the second time, we're going to release a whole lot of information because I can see the fury in her eyes. And and she was holding back today, y'all, but we're going to bring you back. Once again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having us, and I want to thank the listening audience. And please reach out to me at any time. I'm always here, and I'm always available for those folks who are having problems with children being suspended from school, any civil rights violation. Please reach out to me, 919-523-7687. Thank you, and have a great day.
All right, once again, thank you so much. Once again, I'm Gary Jones. Thanks for listening to Get With The Program radio show. As I always say, stay positive, keep your head up, and remember to
Get with the program.
What you talking about?
The program. The program. Get with the program.
Everybody clap to this. Say what?
Get with the program.
It starts now.